Have you ever been so absolutely certain about something? I mean, so convinced of a fact that you'd be willing to bet everything on it? Well, now I want you to imagine watching that one unshakable belief of yours completely and utterly crumble right before your very eyes in just a matter of minutes. That's the incredible story we're diving into today. Those were the words of Rear Admiral Kiji Shibazaki. He was the commander of the Japanese forces on a tiny little atoll in the middle of the Pacific called Tarawa. And this wasn't just some empty boast. His confidence, it was rock solid, rooted in what seemed like an undeniable military calculation, a fortress built not just by human hands, but by nature itself. And this really gets to the very heart of our story today. What happens when all your perfect plans, your mathematical certainties, they just slam head-on into an innovation you couldn't even have dreamed of? This isn't just a war story. It's a story about a catastrophic failure of imagination. Okay, so to really feel the shock that was about to hit, we first have to understand why the Japanese were so supremely confident. Let's take a look at how they turned this tiny speck of land into what they truly believed was an absolutely unbreachable fortress. You see, after the absolute bloodbath at Guadalcanal, Japanese strategy had to change. They couldn't really stay on the attack anymore, so they pivoted hard to defense. The new master plan was called Zeitai Kakuben, the absolute national defense sphere. The whole idea was to make every single island they held so tough, so incredibly costly to attack, that the Americans would just lose the will to keep fighting. These islands, they were going to become unsinkable aircraft carriers, with nature as their #1 weapon. And Tarawa was the crown jewel of this entire strategy. Just try to put yourself in the boots of a Marine about to attack this place. You're facing 500 hardened concrete bunkers crisscrossing the island. You've got 14 heavy coastal defense guns, including 4 massive 8-inch cannons they'd salvaged from an old British ship, all aimed right where you're supposed to land. But you know what? All of that was just icing on the cake. The real weapon, the thing that made Admiral Shibazaki so certain of victory, was a massive coral reef that wrapped around the island like a shield. And here's where the Japanese felt they had the game won before it even started. The math was simple and it was brutal. A standard American landing craft needed about 4 feet of water to float. But that reef, even at high tide, there wasn't enough water. The boats would get stuck, hundreds and hundreds of yards from the shore. This meant thousands of Marines would have to climb out and wade through chest-deep water for 500, maybe even 800 yards. That's a 5-minute walk through a pre-sighted kill zone. They didn't see it as a battle. They saw it as a slaughter. So with this perfect fortress in place, the Japanese just waited. And on the morning of November 20th, 1943, as the American fleet appeared on the horizon, the scene unfolding from their bunkers looked exactly like every drill they had practiced for months. The trap was perfectly set. Okay, check this out. At 8:40 in the morning, the American assault waves form up. Yep, exactly as predicted. At 8:45, Japanese gunners take their aim, just waiting for those boats to get hung up on the reef, waiting for the men to spill out into the water. Everything is going precisely according to plan. And then, at 8:51, the first wave hits the reef, and it just keeps coming. Can you just imagine the sheer jaw-dropping shock? The utter disbelief in those bunkers? One Japanese soldier, watching these strange, grinding machines rise up out of the water like sea monsters and just crawl right over their impenetrable barrier, could only whisper, "The god of death has come." In that single, unbelievable moment, their entire understanding of the war was shattered. So what was this impossible machine? It was the LVT, the landing vehicle tracked. But here's the most incredible part of this whole story. This war-winning weapon, it wasn't born in some advanced military lab. It started its life as a civilian rescue vehicle called the Alligator, designed by a guy named Donald Roebling to save people from hurricanes down in the Florida Everglades, a swamp rescue vehicle, and Japanese intelligence had totally missed it. This one single vehicle completely flipped the script on Japan's entire strategy. Their killer reef, it wasn't a killing zone anymore, it was a highway. All that carefully sighted artillery, totally useless, because the targets were never where they were supposed to be. In less than 15 minutes, 18 months of defensive preparations were made completely obsolete. But here's the thing. The LVT was so much more than just a clever trick that worked one time. It was a symptom of a much, much larger problem. A problem that, for Japan, was completely unsolvable. The shock on Tarawa, that was just the opening act. Take a good long look at this number. Over 18,000. That's how many of these specialized amphibious vehicles the United States pumped out during the war. Not tanks, not planes, just this one specific machine that Japan didn't even know existed until it was climbing over their front door. This table right here, it just lays out the brutal, undeniable reality of the situation. While America was churning out 500 LVTs every single month, sometimes from factories that used to make food machinery, Japan couldn't even get a single effective counterweapon into production. See, they weren't just fighting Marines on a beach, they were fighting the full, unstoppable force of the American industrial base. And this problem, it didn't just happen once, oh no, it grew and it grew, exponentially. At Tarawa, the Japanese faced 125 of these LVTs. Just 8 months later, at Saipan, that number jumped to over 700. And by then, some of them are armed with tank turrets and howitzers. By the time of Okinawa in 1945, the Americans landed with a fleet of over 1,300. It became an unstoppable industrial tidal wave. You know, this admission after the war from one of Japan's highest-ranking naval commanders, it just says it all. Their entire strategy was built on the enemy behaving in a predictable way. But the Americans refused to play by their rules. They just changed the rules of the game entirely. But this was about more than just numbers and machines. You have to understand, the LVT didn't just break through a line of defenses on a beach. It broke the psychological foundation of the entire Japanese war effort. A core belief of the Japanese military was something called Yamato Damashi, this idea that the unique Japanese spirit could overcome any material disadvantage. But how can your spirit stop a machine that ignores the very laws of nature you've built your fortress on? The whole defensive doctrine just collapsed overnight, and this deep sense of hopelessness began to set in. I mean, if the Americans could literally conquer nature itself, what chance did anyone really have? And in a final, absolutely incredible twist, the story of the LVT came full circle. It started its life as a tool for saving people. It was then transformed into a devastating weapon of war. And then, decades later, Japanese companies like Mitsubishi began building similar amphibious vehicles for their original purpose: disaster relief for tsunamis and floods. The very technology that helped defeat their nation eventually returned to its humanitarian roots. So that leaves us with one last thought. The story of Tarawa is just this powerful, powerful lesson in the danger of rigid thinking. The Japanese weren't defeated because of a lack of courage, but because of a failure of imagination. And it forces us to ask ourselves a really tough question. What are the unbreachable reefs in our own thinking? What are the fundamental assumptions we're so sure about today that we can't even begin to imagine a world where they might be totally wrong?